Welcome. Thank you for tuning in. Today's presentation will be around the topic of poverty. It is titled Understanding the Impact of Poverty in Education. My name is Tiffany Powell, and I am the CEO of DrTiffSpeaks, and it is my pleasure to be able to present this information for you today. The whole presentation is divided into two parts. This is part one. It will run for about 15 minutes, and part two will also run for 15 minutes, for a total of 30 minutes for the entire presentation. While you are listening and digesting the information, you should have a notes packet in front of you. I encourage you to take down some notes, jot down your thinking, your wonderings, your observations, anything that comes to mind that would help to galvanize this information for you in a meaningful way. As you all know, the topic of poverty is one that is significant because there are many families, many students that are impacted by poverty. Teachers have to engage with students and families from all types of socioeconomic backgrounds, and it can be extremely daunting and challenging for not only the students but for teachers to understand the dynamics of poverty. It is not a one-dimensional experience. It can happen to anyone from any walk of life, any race, any class, any gender. And it's important to recognize that the role that an educator has in increasing their understanding about the effects of poverty can be great. So this is an opportunity for you to chime in, to listen, to digest, to be challenged in your understanding so that you may grow as an educator in your interaction with families as they may be dealing with a dynamic situation that can also be pretty painful at many points in times as well. So let's start with the definition of poverty. Poverty is the scarcity or the lack of certain amount of material possessions or money. That's the basic definition. But we also recognize that poverty is a multifaceted concept, and this may include social, economic, and political elements, and that's a direct definition from Wikipedia. What's important to recognize is that the multifaceted concept of poverty is that it does not just simply include just having the lack of certain monies or of material possessions, but we're going to digest this concept a little bit further and realize that there are so many connections between what it means to be impoverished that is beyond having just the resources. And so we need to really realize that this is not a one-dimensional, as I mentioned, it is not a one-dimensional experience, but has multiple layers. Here's just some statistics just to give us a frame of reference as we are discussing this topic. It is a little bit dated, and sometimes the research that we use in terms of statistics can be a little bit sort of reference from years prior. So we're currently in 2018, and so this is some statistics from 2016. And this sort of gives us just a bar graph, just a aerial view of students who are reported to be from an impoverished background. And notice that the numbers of Native American or American Indian is pretty significant at 34%. This is sort of across the nation, so this is not just by state, this is sort of a nationwide data set here. We have Asian and Pacific Islander at 12%, Black or African American also at 34%, Hispanic or Latino at 28%, non-Hispanic or white students in a particular population are at 12%, and two or more races at 20%. So for a total of 19% of the student population in 2016 were considered in poverty. Now, the descriptors that are used to identify students in poverty are free and reduced lunch status. So this means that there are families who qualify for free and or reduced lunch, and if they're at that status, they either do not pay anything for lunch or they pay a reduced amount for their lunch services or breakfast services. And so that is what states and the federal level use to identify poverty levels in schools. Because of the multifaceted nature of poverty, we need to understand that financial resources is just one component. Of course, we know that money is significant. Having the financial resources to purchase items, to take trips, to buy clothes, have sufficient food supply, things of that caliber is definitely a component of poverty or lack thereof of those resources, indicating one in poverty. But another idea around the aspect of life that affects poverty is access to opportunities. And so some families who live in a particular community may not have as many opportunities to access the resources that they need to give them entryway into higher education, or to give them entryways into the resources that will even support their higher education experience. So there are some families who do not have anyone in their family who have graduated from college, and sometimes those families have not even graduated from high school. They may be employed, they may have jobs, they may be able to feed their families to some degree, but there may not be anyone in the family who has accomplished a beyond high school education. And so the lack of access to those opportunities can be a sign or an indication of some degree of poverty. Mental illness and physical illness can also contribute to poverty because of oftentimes the inability to be able to work, sometimes the inability to be able to access those opportunities that were just mentioned. And that can just slow people down on so many facets, so many ways. And so this can also be a contributor to why someone may be impoverished. Domestic violence is another area. If families are displaced because of family domestic issues, whether it's a mom and sometimes it's a dad who's displaced from their home, they may find themselves in a shelter or in some other type of protective environment. Just the mental stress of being in a domestic violence situation can also cause people to not go to work or lose their jobs or become sick. It can be so many different things that are connected to domestic violence. It's not just a one component of impoverished families, but it definitely is an aspect that can contribute to it. Of course, there's alcoholism and drug abuse that can also clearly contribute to poverty if resources are being used for that. And then there's this notion around situational versus generational poverty. There's sometimes if someone finds themselves homeless because they lost their job or all of their resources have been depleted, so they may be situationally in an impoverished situation, versus generational poverty where you have family member after family member, line after line, generation after generation, who may find themselves on public assistance, receiving state aid, and not be able to break free from that. So there may be a line of people in that family from one end to the next who have never really maintained full-time employment for a consistent period of time, and those people may find themselves in a generational cycle. When we are talking about this idea of knowledge and what people know and having access, this term called funds of knowledge is very critical, because when we are thinking about impoverished families, those who are not having complete access to opportunities, education, finances, health, or any of those things, there is also still a sense of tenacity that does occur in many families that I think goes often overlooked by educators. And funds of knowledge is the knowledge and skills derived from a family and cultural background. And something that I will say that's significant is that many children who have experienced lack, who have experienced just, you know, under uh, approved or unacceptable, conditions, there's something else that does rise up in them that really gives them the know-how of how to survive. And we consider that to be a fund of knowledge. They have this sense of tenacity and perseverance that many would crumble under those conditions, but they have found the fortitude to be able to press forward. A lot of times around this notion of the funds of knowledge is based on this premise that knowledge is cumulative and is culturally developed. And the sense of cultural development is that these students have been able to galvanize the resources around this, regardless of their situation, to push forward and to know how to do a lot with a little. There's families who have been given $20 and they have to feed 6 people for a couple of days, and they are just astute and just skillful at being able to use their knowledge of the community, of what their resources can be and how it can be stretched to make it work. An example of that is there are many families like that grew up in the South and their resources may have been limited, but mom, grandmom, somebody knew how to take those limited resources, that meat, that pasta, that rice, or whatever it may have been, and they made it stretch to feed an entire family of maybe 10, 15 people at various family functions. They made it work. And so that is a fund of knowledge. And this is accrued knowledge that's essential for survival. This is important because if teachers are able to recognize that students who may come from unacceptable or even not the best living conditions or living situations, if they come with this knowledge that is just makes them so tenacious, it's important for teachers to recognize who's in front of them and realize that students, regardless of their situation, it is not an indication that of whether or not they can learn, but that they have this sense of fortitude that keeps them pushing forward in a way that is amazing. It's important for a teacher to recognize this and also begin to explore some of the cultural realities that their students may possess. Is really important. This next term is around cultural capital, and this has to do with social mobility. And when we talked earlier about poverty not being just related to resources, but having social and social implications, this is an example of that. Cultural capital is knowing how to move up and down a social ladder, understanding some norms, understanding some ways, and understanding how to navigate environments. And this is a critical skill for students who are impoverished and who may not know certain kinds of things, but they have an experience where they do know how to navigate social environments. And if they don't know, they can certainly be taught. This cultural capital is around tangible and intangible experiences. It uses skills and things like music taste, things around being able to understand how to use place settings on tables. And families who come from more wealthy backgrounds, they understand cultural capital as well, and they are the ones who have had certain kinds of experiences that situate them to be able to use this knowledge for their advantage. But cultural capital is not limited to income or net worth or financial measure. It has to do with the knowledge, the skills, the intangible abilities that people bring to environments so that they're able to navigate those settings. So someone who lives in a particular community, maybe they're from an urban environment, they know who the go-to people are in that community. They're able to talk to that person and get some information or get some resources to be able to assist them in some kind of meaningful way. They have social mobility in the way that someone who is not from that community would not be able to do. The important other ideas around cultural capital is that it's institutionalized and that it can fall into this category of being educational, specialized knowledge. You know how to use that information in that arena. It's embodied. It has to do with personality, speech, or skills, how you move, if you use slang that is indicative of the environment. That can be really important. And the last is that it's objectified. It has to do with clothing and your belongings. And giving these particular elements cultural capital is difficult to measure objectively, but it's really important. And if we pay attention attention to our surroundings, we'll recognize that we all have funds of knowledge and cultural capital that make us all the more skillful in navigating our environments. So I'm going to wrap up part 1. I'll be back with part 2.